Good evening, everyone. My name is Camille Rogers, and I'm the Alumni Relations and Marketing Officer for the UCD College of Arts and Humanities. I'm delighted to welcome you to the 20th edition of UCD in Conversation webinar series and our last episode of 2020. Through this series, we welcome our alumni community from around the world to listen as fellow alumni, UCD academics, and guests share their stories and ideas. The series also reflects UCD's Rising to the Future strategy and its 4 strategic themes, which are creating a sustainable global society, transforming through digital technology, building a healthy world, and empowering humanity. Belfield 50, the subject of this evening's conversation, is a celebration for the generations of students and staff who breathed life into the campus over these 5 decades. This evening's format will be a 45-minute conversation moderated by UCD alumnus Seán Rocks. Seán presents Arena, RTÉ Radio 1's flagship arts, popular culture, and entertainment program. He has been in the role since 2009 and has interviewed major writers, actors, musicians, and artists. He has worked with RTÉ Radio since 2000, presenting several daytime programs on RTÉ Lyric FM before moving to Radio 1. Prior to broadcasting, he worked extensively as an actor, both at home and abroad, appearing at the Abbey, Peacock, and Gate theaters with many more independent companies. Tonight, he'll be speaking with Dr. Ellen Rowley, Assistant Professor in Modern Irish Architecture in UCD School of Architecture, Planning, and Environmental Policy, as well as renowned photographer Daniel Holfeld, who was commissioned to create an exhibition interpreting UCD's campus through his artistic eye and photographic lens. So now it is my pleasure to hand it over to you, Seán.
Thank you very much, Camille, and delighted to be part of the whole Belfield 50 celebrations. And hopefully over the next 45 minutes or so, bring back memories for those of you who have spent time on this campus over the last half century or so, whether you're among those very early graduates who are here just as the campus was beginning to build itself and be built, or like myself, perhaps you were here in the middle years, I'm going to call it. Well, in fact, I was here in the early noughties. I was working, studying a master's just for a year, but kind of work my way around the campus, but I can still manage to get lost on a daily basis cycling through the campus when I do. Or maybe you're even a very recent alumnus of the university and aware not only of how things have changed in recent years, but of the future plans as well. And very much that's what we'd like to open up in this conversation. And helping me to take those trips down memory lane, Dr. Ellen Rowley, Assistant Professor in Modern Irish Architecture in UCD's School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy. She is the co-editor, which is vitally important in terms of our conversation this evening, co-editor with Finola O'Kane of a wonderful publication called Making Belfield. I'll just hold it up in front of my face. It is just super in terms of the stories it tells, of the pictures that are in there as well. And she spoke to me, in fact, Ellen, about the book on the programme. And it was after that I was asked about moderating this conversation. I said, yes, absolutely, because I want to spend more time finding out about what's in the book. And also with us is Daniel Holfeld, a graduate with a degree in photography from Dublin's Institute of Technology in 2008. And Daniel has always had quite an interest in architecture and particularly large open spaces. So he's developed a passion around that type of complex language and admiration, and he's developed an admiration for that style of architecture and has then translated that, if you like, very difficult task, from the 3 dimensions of an architectural space into 2 dimensions. And his exhibition, Conveying Space, will really open up ways of, I suppose, Daniel's response to the campus in many ways, and he'll guide us through that over the next 45 minutes as well. And he was the perfect person, obviously, with those interests to give us Conveying Space. We'll also be talking about the Timeline exhibition, which really does what that title suggests, tells us the story of the Belfield campus, and you can see it without having to go into a building. And you know, we're in those times when you talk about any type of space, it has to be a socially distant space, and that's why we're obviously in a webinar, but we can get right into the middle of all these buildings and all of their stories with Ellen and Daniel right now. I suppose the first part of the story, Ellen, goes right back to why and when and how did the UCD campus find itself in the suburbs? Because up until that point, we really are talking about the university was a thing of the city centre, certainly in this country, and it was only beginning to work its way out into the suburbs. How did that happen? What's that story in the case of UCD?
Well, I would say, Seán, that it's a story of resistance in the first instance, because it wasn't a move that was easily or quickly made. I suppose it really is accelerated with the presidency of Michael Tierney, who's professor of Greek, and he becomes president in 47. And by that time, the site, Earlsfort Terrace and around Stephen's Green, was becoming so overcrowded, as well as what's now government buildings, the Science, College of Science on Merrion Street. And so all of these sites were really just very overcrowded and problematic. And Tierney talks to the professor of architecture, J.V. Downes, about what to do. And for a period through the late 1940s and into the early 50s, they explored the potential of staying in town. And really the interest is from the faculty, I would say, to stay in town, and from the students. But there's a government report, and also J.V. Downes' own interest in modernism, push everybody eventually towards the potential of open space from an educational perspective, for research and for social amenity. So there's a government report in 57, and they go off and look all around Britain and all around Denmark and Sweden, and they come back and they basically state in this, and this tallies with what J.V. Downes, the modernist architect, is saying, that if you need 600,000 square feet of university space, which is what UCD needed, they reckoned, then you also need 13 acres of land. So there must be the same indoor space as there is outdoor space. So it's this, I suppose, this appetite for open space, which is a zeitgeist kind of thing at the time, because you've got all sorts of schools and all the housing and all shopping centres being shifted to the suburbs. So it's very much tallying with that trend and fashion.
You also have a film called Shaping Belfield, a 10-minute film, which is, if you like, a kind of potted history of what we're talking about here in this webinar as well. And there's an interesting clip at the beginning of that, of Michael Tierney talking about the move to the campus here. So let's have a listen to that.
I see it developing greatly in its new site, where there's plenty of room. I hope to see all the faculties move out, and to see student amenities and residential accommodation and everything that's needed in a modern university provided out on the new site. I think when that is done, it will be a worthy university for the people of Ireland.
And that's Dr. Michael Tierney there speaking at the beginning of the film, Shaping Belfield, obviously an archive clip that you found there, Dr. Ellen Rowley. And he's such a soft-spoken man and seems so quiet and demure, but he must have had enormous passion and enormous clout and political astuteness to actually manage the move, because it was a difficult one to manage.
Yeah, without a doubt. And not only was there his own faculty would have been opposed to that, but there was actually a kind of a lobbyist movement and a group called On Tuirim, who issued a report at the same time, which is saying, like, why go there? We need to stay in town, because in town we've all the attendant cultural institutions, and the whole, I suppose, the more layered business of the city is what a university needs. But he maintains that, I suppose, following from Cardinal, now Saint John Henry Newman, that we should have everything in one site, and that really includes residences, social amenity for students, and that academics, other staff members and students should be constantly connecting and overlapping. So he seems to be really driven by that. And in that clip, he talks about making a national university for the ordinary people of Ireland.
Yeah.
So he's really conscious of the need to create technocratic spaces, proper science labs. Even though he's a classics professor, he's really on the side of that the university must create this more technocratic workforce as well, you know. So he's got this really interesting vision that follows from Newman, the Victorian, and then brings us into the mid-century Irish landscape.
Yeah, and you're talking about connecting and overlapping there between the student body and the academics in the college as well. But that's exactly what was wanted in terms of the buildings, in terms of the campus that was going to be developed and started here. An international competition, because I guess too many rounds if you started at home, you'd still be working out who's going to get this, who's going to win the prize of designing the campus. They went to an international competition. Who won it, and who was practically unknown, really, was he at the time?
Yeah, he was totally unknown. I mean, it's considered the most democratic process. It's the most drawn out, the most expensive, but the most culturally sophisticated way of procuring a serious building. And in a project like this, don't forget that since independence, not a penny had been spent on further education by the state. It wasn't a priority. So it was coming apart at the seams. They had to spend money. So UCD was almost like the Petri dish, if you like, for this. So they went international. The architectural profession insisted that it be a competition. It became international, and they had a lot of international advisors from day one anyway. As Tierney was acquiring land out in Stillorgan, he had an international advisor talk to him about what to do. And the first of those advisors was designing new towns in Britain. So the whole idea of a blank canvas site was very popular. Anyway, the international competition goes out, and we have applications from over 20 countries. In the end, this utterly unknown and pretty much unbuilt, very young architect who'd only graduated 2 years before from the technical school in Warsaw, Andrzej Wejhert, wins, and he designs it apparently, you know, in his mother's kitchen. But we always hear these kind of myths, and I'm not sure if that's true. But he arrives over, and he of course he's given the gig to design the master plan and 2 buildings. Well, in fact, 3 buildings, but one doesn't happen: the arts building and administration. But the government are clearly nervous about any one individual getting the whole gig. So they say, we will have another competition for a library, because that's the kind of metaphysical and physical heart of a university. And also we're going to bring in other fine designers to do things like the restaurant building, and so later agriculture, engineering. So what he has to do is provide this kind of infrastructure for these other buildings to be dropped down later stages.
Right. So he really gives us the master plan, and that idea of connection, of overlapping in the way he designs the space. He really looks for open spaces, connecting spaces, and connecting the buildings. But you mentioned then that we begin to get others designing new buildings, and I suppose buildings that are very functional is what we have to remember here. The library and the restaurant in particular. You might talk to us about what considerations there were for those, and I think we can see some images maybe as you're talking here as well.
Well, I think one of the reasons that Wejhert's design was liked was that it wasn't too rigid and it wasn't too determined. So there was an elasticity built into it. And so he has this spine, which we'll see later on at some point, because Daniel responded to that. And then these buildings are coming off the spine, or like a stem. And so the bigger these object buildings, or these other functions that are needed, were always in the first instance to be secondary to Wejhert's stem or spine, if you like. But yeah, the 2 kind of buildings of collective or communal university life that aren't dependent on any one faculty would be the restaurant building, which was designed by Robin Walker, and it wins a gold medal for the RAI in 1970. And then the earlier building is it starts earlier, is the library, which is designed by Scottish modernist Hardy Glover from Spence Glover Ferguson, and that's another competition from 1966. And both of these buildings they're difficult buildings to inherit and to live with today, and they've been adapted, and they're constantly being adapted. And today, for instance, the restaurant building wouldn't be used at all as it was conceived of, where everybody would be getting their lunch and dinner on site. So it was to turn over a huge amount of plates, and it was this really technological whiz kid of a servery that rotated, and they went to America to look at this system. So everything was very cutting edge. This was very brave new world. And similarly, the library was to be the largest open access browsable library in the country, and one of the largest in Europe, and it continues to be that. So,
yeah, that's one of the big memories I have of my time here, is the time in the library, and you could go up there and not be in the aisle you should be in at all for your studies, but
yeah.
off browsing in other aisles, which is, I suppose, what the library's all about. And very interesting. I'd love to, you know, that idea of the serving, the kind of automated server. I'm sure there are those watching tonight that must remember actually eating food served to them in that fashion, which is very interesting.
Yeah,
indeed.
I mean,
but just to get us to Daniel, because I want to get to Daniel's reaction, which is what his exhibition is all about. The final solo work that Behert gives us is probably the most iconic image, I think, for many people when they think UCD Belfield. They're going to think the water tower. And I mean, even when we see an image of it here, it's so magnificent. It's so striking. It's so sculptural, really. I mean, I cycle past this every single day, and it never ceases to amaze me. It was kind of unusual in amongst the flatness and the functionality, even though it does have a function, but you know, the kind of the aesthetics, the functional aesthetics of the other buildings. Would you say, Ellen, in those terms?
Excuse me. Yeah, so it is ultimately a functional building because it's a water tower, Seán. So they estimated in the 70s that every student should have 10 gallons of water for themselves. So it held 150 gallons of water in this mad 12-sided dodecahedron tank sitting on a 5-sided pentagonal stem. And then that geometry is even further emphasized by this 2-inch fluting in the concrete pour. Yeah. So it's a really sophisticated pour technical structure. But very quickly, by 1979, when there's these inaugural Irish Concrete Society Awards, it's the first one to win the award. So it very quickly turns into something, as you say, sculptural aesthetic, and because it bursts through the sky, and it's the only vertical the most
absolutely.
obvious vertical announcement.
And when you think of the south side of Dublin City, you do think, really, you know, people still marvel at the fact that we have 2-story houses for the most part. There are some apartment blocks now, but you're talking about a very flat landscape. So this really does punctuate it. And Daniel, it's hardly surprising that when you started thinking about how you might convey the space of UCD, that the water tower was one of the first things that you hit.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what happened with this work was I had been given the green light to go in and to start working, but then of course COVID restrictions kicked in, the campus was closed, and I had all this time on my hands to sort of think about the first starting point or where I would like to start. I didn't have to look very far to think the water tower was the place to go, really. But again, with all the icons of UCD, one thing I was aware of or responsible for as being an artist was how to interpret it through my own way and in an autonomous way, so that there's no predetermined value or there's no predetermined strategy, but rather a strategy unfolds as I engage, or rather as how the space activates me as an artist. And I think that's something you mentioned in my intro about large open spaces, and it's really this activation as an artist that I respond to. And you'll see here there's 2 images, and these both obviously were in the show. We included both of them as a diptych, really to bookend the show. The image on the right is icon 1, and then the image on the left is icon 2. But the image on the right, icon 1, was taken, I think, at 10:30 in the morning on a Thursday. I'd been given access. I went straight there. The sun was shining, and it was my first response. It wasn't premeditated. It wasn't predetermined. This was it. And so this really shaped then my strategy and how I would navigate through the campus and through the different structures. And the close cropping is something that prior to this series, I had worked on another series, and it was this close cropping process is something that I really expanded upon here. But even coming back to what you had said about, you know, we're all living in a socially distanced world now, this intimacy that I get with these images by getting up close and personal to the water tower, so close that you can really see the skin and the flesh, and that when it's printed in the exhibition, the viewer can almost touch the surface of the water tower, was really important to me. I mean, this stands 60 meters high above the ground. Who can ever get this close to it in reality? You can't. But this way of photographing it, I'm on the ground, I'm looking up with a zoom lens, and I'm focusing on composing this structural geometric, balanced and harmonized, our abstract rendering of it, which gives me then, you know, the first image, icon 1. And again, here you'll see in both images the cloudless skies. So this was also something that, you know, I was shooting in June, so I would wait until I would get days where the weather was just perfect. So not a cloud in the sky, complete clarity, complete blue. Obviously here it's varying shades of gray, but the reason why I'm doing that is it acts like a canvas then. It's like another layer as a blank canvas, and really highlights the character of the building and the silhouette of the building, which is then icon 2. And for me, you know, I struggled about including both of them because I thought maybe icon 1 was enough in its own right. But if you zoom out just that little bit, you get the beautiful structure and the beautiful shapes that Ellen was talking about, that obviously Weyhert had worked so cleverly or smartly to introduce on his landscape. But particularly here, what's important for me is the play between light and dark, the public, the intimate, the public. And even that little half moon crescent shape illumination on the left side versus the complete darkness on the right is just enough detail for anybody to know or to make out exactly what it is, where it is. I mean, you talked about it as being this beacon of the campus and of South County Dublin, and it really is. So all throughout the series, I sort of play with this experiment of just how much do I need to conceal and how much do I need to reveal in order for the structure to remain recognizable.
Yeah, well, obviously, if any of the members of Pink Floyd had been UCD alumni, we'd have The Dark Side of the Water Tower would have been perhaps their most famous album. It really does. And it almost comes, I have this, and I know anthropomorphization is a dodgy subject at the best of times, but you do have the sense of this kind of silent sphinx almost watching over the entire campus in the way that you've pictured it, I think there, Daniel. We should point out, how many pictures, how many photographs in total did you take to get to the exhibition?
Yeah, I think I'm a bit of a child of the digital revolution. So I think I took something close to about 10,000 or 12,000 photographs, because I'm completely indulgent when it comes to my work. I don't censor my reactions. I don't censor my responses. So if there's anything that piques my curiosity, I go in with my camera, and a lot of these images are scrapbook images, but also a lot of them are me working out just in what way and at what time the light hits these particular buildings, because you know, all throughout the months that I was working, I never got this light again. So either, you know, the axis of the planets had moved, the sun had moved, and at that particular time, I never got that illumination so clearly and so crisply as I did on that moment. So yeah, I mean, 10,000 pictures and then 19 images made it to the show. So the editing process was a little bit tricky.
You had a lot to throw away to get from 10,000 down to 19. You mentioned that we had the morning time picture for the first of the icons there, and then it was obviously the evening time for the second, but there was a nighttime shoot as well. Was that was the Walkways? Was it the Walkways was the only place that you shot at night?
Exactly. So here we have, I titled it Night Walk, and you know, this image is a really good example of that balance between chance and control as a photographer, and how you interact with spaces. So originally, before I got to this image, I was working on campus at I think 2 o'clock in the morning, and thankfully estate services had let me in and they had illuminated the buildings, but I wasn't getting what I wanted from the original building that I went to shoot. So I sort of abandoned it and parked it and went for a walk. And in that walk is when I encountered these canopied walkways lit at nighttime. And of course, like the water tower, it was another icon of UCD that I was quite nervous about interacting, because everybody has a story about the walkways, whether it's dodging the rain, running to class, or whatever it is. I mean, everybody knows them and they're so iconic. So I very gently approached them as to how I could make them my own. And ultimately, I decided that shooting it at 2 a.m. in the morning was the way to go. And experiencing the campus at that time is a very different experience to daylight. The structures look different, the fluorescent lighting is different, and the language is different. And for this particular image, I lay on the ground on my chest with my tripod in front of me, and I'm literally 12 inches, my tripod camera is 12 inches above the ground, looking up on a slow shutter to capture it. And what's unlike the other images where the blue sky becomes the blank canvas, here it's the dead of night that's the blank canvas. And you get that beautiful T structure, the depth of field, almost otherworldly reading of the structure. And that to me was actually quite a surprise that it would go down that road of otherworldliness, next generation, space landing, quite futuristic, because it was built in 1972. And so here we're taking an object from 1972, photographing it decades later, and carrying the conversation further and hopefully creating a new aesthetic experience of that structure.
And maybe just explain to us too, Daniel, for those who haven't seen the exhibition, the nature, we're talking about that image, but we can clearly see that it's an image of the image, if you like. It's, you know, it's taken outside the Tierney building here, in fact, where we are, where I'm speaking from today. How did you go about then mounting the 19 that you did choose from your 10,000?
Yeah, well, twofold. One, it was a very organic reaction to COVID restrictions. You know, it seemed the obvious route to put it outside so that everybody could enjoy it. I mean, I think, you know, I'm not wrong when I say everyone needed a bit of escapism this year, and that this could offer that for viewers. But also, one thing that became apparent as I worked on campus, there were so many recreational users who would come up to me and engage with me and ask me what I was doing. I mean, I was, you know, running around, running up buildings, down buildings, cameras coming out of me, you know, looking very much like, probably like a lost lamb, but secretly finding these images. And so they would engage and ask me, and I thought, on hindsight, when it got to that stage, that they too really ought to experience this exhibition, and that it should be something that the entire recreational community can engage with and can see. And so having them and putting them outside was then a process where we worked with the production company of them, because they had to be weatherproofed and waterproof, etc., and very heavy. So the bases there are actually lined with cement panels to keep them weighted to the ground. But the response to putting it outside, I think a lot of people seem to have appreciated that access and that open access anyway.
Ellen, the fact that Daniel was walking through the campus late at night when it was practically deserted, and he was drawn to this walkway, he was drawn to the movement that in fact Weghert had there in his design from the very outset. It says a lot about the quality of that concept.
It's not accidental, is it? Yeah, it's
no.
Very good point. Yeah, and I mean, he then when I'd say these were nearly one of the last things of Wegert's design to be built, because obviously they're small and fiddly and they can't get in the way of the bigger structures. So we can see them being built here in this image from 71 as the Tierney building is being finished, and we have that amazing tunnel that links the Tierney to the Newman, the arts building, this perspex. It's a real moment of James Bond. All of that's completely intact. But the walkways, I mean, by the time that this was all finished, and then Weghert builds his kind of last Farah, where he's able to really have fun in the water tower in 72, then he's kind of flitting on the edges in 73, and he's saying, you know, I want to still stay involved, and we need to hold tight to my master plan to the east-west axis across the campus. So it's like a line moving, and then there's an elbow. It's like the elbow bending, if you like. And that's at the lake. It bends up and goes over to the restaurant building.
Is that the image that we would see again from the Shaping Belfield film?
Yes.
The spine will give us a sense of that. Let's just look at that. We've taken the audio out, so you might talk us through what we're looking at here.
Yeah. So I suppose the image on the walkway starts at the top right there, as the camera shows us, and we move down past science, past agriculture, down to the library, and then it turns, it bends basically. So it's extremely, it's not accidental that you're drawn to it as you suggest. And in 73, Weghert wants to continue. He's afraid that the walkway is going to dissipate this line, the linear connectivity nature of the master plan is going to dissipate. And he asks that UCD continues to make these walkways. That doesn't really happen because of various funding and all the rest of it. But the walkway serves to, I think, very importantly, ameliorate these mega structures. So the scale of like the arts building, the library, and to a lesser extent the restaurant and admin, like they're big bombastic structures, King Kongs to a degree, that have either fallen down from space or burst up in a monster sense. So the walkways are very human scale. They're just above, if you're walking, they're just above your head, and if you're in a wheelchair and you're in a bike, you really are, you feel your scale has been met, your need for grounding and all of that has been met. So they very much work to mediate between you on the ground and these mega structures, especially the arts building, as does kind of the steps and terracing that we see throughout the original master plan, like say the few steps down to the lake and the few steps up to Tierney and then up again to restaurant, and now where the new lake is. So it's this constant stepping, slight shift in your horizon. And he's responding to the undulations of the landscape too, because not forgetting that this wasn't just a green field. There were 11 villa gardens and hedges and really deliberate views that had been made by all these different owners over time. And he's not coming, he wants to take advantage of those shifting views too. And I think that kind of partialness, not complete, where you're getting openings here, there, and everywhere, is what everybody liked about it initially, you know.
Yeah, and you've mentioned, you know, the nature of the big bombastic, I think was the word you used there to describe some of the buildings. I mean, they are big, imposing structures, and I think, in fact, Daniel, when you started this project, you thought that those big, imposing, brutalist type of structures, in fact, that you'd be looking at brutalist architecture, that you'd be looking at a very different response.
Yeah, absolutely. So prior to this, I had come from basically traveling across Spain and Portugal in search of postmodernist, highly colored buildings inspired by the work of the Mexican architect Luis Barragan. So I had I was in this color state of mind. I thought what I was going to do was engage with the brutalist concrete and overlay them with beautiful color panels. And then very clearly it became apparent that pure photography was the way to go and that it didn't need any embellishment. But to come back then to your bombastic phrasing of those buildings, in between those buildings, there's a delicacy, and there are these little vignettes of much smaller attention and much smaller consideration, but equally as iconic. So in this, for example, the images that have been taken up on screen here and the image on the left, converging lamppost, that's exactly why this image to me is so successful, because it's a lamppost. Technically, most people write it off as being a lamppost. It's not as fabulous and as big and amazing as the other buildings that house thousands of students. But here, what I was trying to do with the utilitarian functionality of the lamppost is to turn it into more of an icon of design and linear abstraction. And in a way, there's a sort of a grading between the sky, the lamppost, the steel, the metal, the concrete blocks. And this silence in its composition, that really creates this new language that I was trying to find, and this space between, or a connective tissue between these buildings.
Yeah, and I'm noticing again the days that you were photographing. I mean, the sky is almost, you would think that was photoshopped in. It's so perfect.
Yeah, well, it was a lot of waiting around. Like there were some times when I might wait for 2 weeks for a perfect day to shoot in, and I know a lot of people would say just Photoshop it in, but for me, in a weird way, I feel like I have to get it right in the raw frame and in the negative, so to speak. So it just illuminates everything so much nicer, and it makes everything a little bit more aspirational, which again was something that I wanted for the narrative and language that I was speaking. Not to mention, you need those deep dark shadows. I mean, the shadow work here and the play between light and dark is so significant that it highlights so many different aspects. And here we have the Confucius Institute set against the old engineering building. So in a weird way, the degrees of grayscale also are the degrees of different decades of facades of these buildings.
And we've kind of mentioned the lake and then skipped past it, and it would be very foolish to skip past the lake, I think, Ellen, because they say everybody has a lake story. Most of them totally unrepeatable, I would guess. Don't know if you have one or not that you're prepared to share with us. No, I didn't think so. But you might share despite the fact that it is the part of the campus that for many students holds fond and not so fond memories, it is a functional aspect as well as an aesthetic aspect, like the water tower.
Yeah, well, actually, it was your colleague, Clíona Anlún, who alerted to me to the most gas piece of footage in the whole of RTÉ archive, which is 76 Rag Week in UCD with these boyos in the lake rowing around. It's absolutely hilarious, and everyone can go online and have a look at it. We have a tiny bit of it in our Shaping Belfield film, which is available on the website. But yeah, the lake had to be there. There was always to be provision for the lake, because before Weyhert won the competition, Tierney had appointed 3 architectural advisors, and they had already been mapping the land as to what might happen here, notionally as it moved from Merville and the woodland over to the Belgrove Valley as more sites were acquired. And always there was to be a big lake, and that was for fire safety, basically. Yeah. Apparently there are 7 million litres in the current lake, and it is this functional reservoir, just like the water tower is about providing enough high pressure water for the science labs, which had just been finished, you know, the first building in 62 to 64. So the lake, and then of course it's become the place of public resort and leisure. And I suppose the most, I think a really important moment for the Belfield campus away from Weyhert was when Ronnie Tallon came in and designed the O'Reilly Hall. I mean, I'm jumping around here, but
yeah, no, that's fine.
You know, you really can't think about the lake today, or anyone who came to UCD, as I would have done in the 90s, without thinking about the new Aula Maxima, which was never built in the initial project as was supposed to be. And then it's this beautiful ceremonial minimalist temple on the lake. So the lake was then a refocus from 1994 onwards, arguably.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's really what I would say about the lake.
We'll come back to Aula Maxima. Just before I move off the lake, Daniel, was it something what struck you about the lake from the photographic point of view and from the exhibition's point of view?
Well, I think for me, the lake and that entire area was its openness and its sense of calm. I mean, I know it has this functionality area in terms of people moving and coming and going and etc. But really, when it came to us, for me, it acquired its significance as to where we would put the exhibition. So it really is this point where almost every student walks past and interacts and exchanges. So when myself and Ailish, we were talking about where would we put the exhibition, there was no other option really but to put it between the Tierney building and the lake. I mean, that's really the epicenter. So for us, that's why it was so significant.
Yeah, you're talking about Ailish O'Brien there, the Director of Communications here in UCD. The 1980s, anybody who was at college in the 1980s probably remembers the type of economy that we were living in at that time, Ellen. It was a very difficult time in Ireland, for sure. How did that reflect or play into what could be developed, I suppose? And we're looking here on the screen. We have some of the images from the Timeline exhibition, which, as I said, available. You can look at it through the windows of the restaurant. You don't actually have to go in if you're feeling worried about the social distance side of things. Again, a bit like Daniel's exhibition, you can view it quite calmly and safely from outside. The 79-80, difficult time for any public organisation, depending on finance.
Yeah. Yeah, the Timeline exhibition, these 2 shots here, we should say this graphic design was designed by a student of ours, and much of the kind of Belfield 50 project, the research and all of that came out of modules that I and colleagues taught in architecture and engineering. And we actually, while we put the Timeline, we decided to compromise and put it outside the restaurant building. So you go down the stairs to the basement and you just walk around decade by decade, and it's keeping architecture as a central theme, but overlaying all sorts of international and national stats and facts. But we had actually planned to be inside the basement of the restaurant building, and we designed we have an installation made by the students, which hopefully next year can go in there, fingers crossed. So that's just to say. But yeah, going back to what you asked there, Seán, I suppose one kind of poster child project which says it all is the engineering building. which is on the next slide, the right-hand side of the next slide, and indeed the agriculture, which is beside it. Both of these here say it all. I mean, the engineering building was planned from 73. A board of assessors had appointed Ronnie Tallon, who was then just about to design the Papal Cross, and he had just finished designing the Bank of Ireland on Bagot Street. So he's very much a really important current designer in terms of the spirit of the age of Ireland. And so he's appointed in 75. But that building isn't finished and occupied until 1989, which speaks to exactly what you're talking about, these budgetary limitations. Now, Weyhert is raising his hand. Him and his wife, Danuta, have started a firm at this point, and they're like, hiya, we're still here. So they're meanwhile making the sports centre, which is finished in 81. The agricultural building is paid for by the World Bank and the Department of Agriculture, and it's finished in 1980. But you know, the whole idea, I suppose, the whole idea of this kind of master plan is this is when it disappears, because everyone's so hungry for funds that it's kind of a project by project halting development that starts to take place. And it's at this point for a while, and luckily we've got it back, that Weyhert's vision of the natural environment is slightly pushed to the side, and you get quite a few surface car parks rising to the surface. Now, luckily, in the last 15 years, there's been a real pullback from that, and a new lake has been introduced, and the natural landscape has come to the fore, I would say, again. But so the engineering building it's finished in 1989, and at that point it's the single largest educational building in the history of the state, but only one half of it is built. But it's interesting because the oil crisis has struck. So where before all the buildings have bands of glazing and they're hot houses in the summer and freezing in the winter, you know, the typical mid-century modernism, the engineering building has these tiny windows. So it's our first post-oil crisis building where we're conscious of the cost of energy. So it's really, it's an interesting reflection of the international situation.
And towards the end of the decade, then, when those buildings were finished, that you spoke about, was that before anything complete? Wasn't there an alumnus donation that really helped things move along here in a way that it just wouldn't have been possible?
Yeah, I think the next slide probably shows that it might show the 1990, the 1990 timeline window, and the image in the upper centre is O'Reilly Hall, which of course, it's completely foregrounded by this lake. Talking to Daniel's expanse open, it's the void with loads of potential, isn't it? So for the first time, I understand, an alumnus donated quite a sizable amount of money, AJ O'Reilly, 2 million. And that really starts a whole new process of procurement of buildings towards kind of alumnus endowment. And you kind of have that model followed, certainly around the Upper Lake with the Sutherland School of Law and the Quinn and Moore Schools of Business and the O'Brien Centre for Science. So it kind of changes everything. And Tallon is kept on as the architect. He's just finished, as I say, the engineering building and the industry centre, and he works with a host of artists to create this very interesting ceremonial space with all these newly commissioned artworks in panels embedded into the oak panelling interior.
And down in the bottom corner of that panel that we're looking at now, the 1994 panel, which of the rooms is that? Which of the halls is that?
That's the O'Reilly Hall, precisely. John, sorry, my sight is brutal, and that image, that's the O'Reilly Hall. The other thing we can see there, and I promised I wouldn't get bogged down on the detail of the timeline, but we start to see the residences appear.
Yes.
And they start to appear in 89, and then Belfield campus changes completely because it becomes an occupied place at night and at day. So when you start to house people, your whole understanding of the university becomes more complicated, you know.
Very different. It's a very different thing indeed. I was thinking when we were looking at the timeline exhibition in 1981 with the sports hall, I was not in this college that did doing my primary degree as a primary school teacher, in fact, out in Kerrysford. And I remember that building, when that sports building appeared in 1981, the jealousy of many colleges, I'd say, was enormous. That building, I think, for you, Daniel, it was quite significant in terms of your response in the exhibition as well, wasn't it? The old sports centre in 1981.
The old sports centre for me just came as a huge surprise. I mean, it's kind of, if you drive around it or if you walk around it, it's actually quite hidden behind things. So, you know, you have the hockey pitch and then, you know, the tennis courts and the water tower further afield. So it's actually quite nestled in, and you know, so to get to it, you kind of have to go through various different steps and get up there, and there's trees there. So it's quite obscured, and certainly these platforms that I was on wouldn't be the platforms that most people would probably walk around it. So for me, I found this, you know, as a complete surprise, and really what it then became was a study of concrete and glass and even those railings. So these utilitarian objects suddenly become a thing of design when contrasted against those beautiful lines and grooves in the concrete. But the image on the left, concrete mass, for me, it's my biggest homage to the love of concrete. And I think any concrete lovers out there will respond to that. And certainly that beautiful linear alignment and its simplicity, and it's lit so well with the sunshine and the beautiful gray sky. You know, that is, if I had to have a moment of calm or a moment of zen in my show, that would have been that moment of peace and quiet. It is just such a simple and yet striking composition. So achieving that image, in front of it, there's actually a gym. So as I was photographing it, I had all these people in the gym kept on coming out, kind of staring at me, looking at me, going, what is he doing? What is he doing? Because I was squatting, I was getting up on ledges, and I was doing all these sort of weird, probably yogic positions to try and get this angle. But you know, it's a really slow way of working, because you're looking and you're looking and you're trying to align everything. I mean, even there to the right side of that frame is just that converging point where everything just comes together, but then the rest of the frame is cancelled out. So to get all that into one negative and one frame, it takes time and consideration. So it's a very slow process. And then with the image on the right, the game walls, what I really loved about it, and it's such a small feature of it, but it's those black glass windows that just puncture that, you know, the light gray concrete and the sky and the darkness beforehand. So again, it's composition and it's design and abstracting it into a separate aesthetic experience in its own.
We do need to finish up, but Daniel, let me just bring up a final image of yours, which is the aloft and white space. This is the O'Brien Centre for Science. This was in your way. This is your saying, if you wanted to capture the whole idea and the looking forward, these are the images that you would choose?
Again, came as a surprise. I went into it being very familiar with the brutalist concrete architecture, and then upon entering the O'Brien Centre for Sciences, I was aware of it through a fashion commission that I had done there. But really, aloft, it took my breath away. I stood there and it opened up my pores. It expanded my senses. It is aspirational. It's next generation, and it's almost space age. For me, standing at the bottom of those stairs looking up, it's as if your eye travels up the potential, or the human potential of the mind, and if it's an incubating space. And that's really what I tried to get across with it, as well as it being very futuristic and almost like Stanley Kubrick film 2001: Space Odyssey. These beautiful white panels and cascading features.
And the final image I'd call up is one of the campus back at the very beginning and right now. I mean, really to get a sense of where we head in the future, Ellen, this area view gives us something to look forward to, doesn't it?
Yeah, the view on the left there, Seán, is was what Fahert put in as his winning design. So it was never built. You see that triangle is the aula maxima that he had planned, but he could see when he arrived here that there was no steel. These were all steel and glass buildings, and when he realized it was so green and damp and grey, he wanted to make concrete, and really white concrete. So he used Wicklow granite, crushed, and aggregates, white aggregates. But so that's what that is. But what you're looking at on the right then is the future campus, and it's really in earnest UCD attempting to finally, having kind of an aborted attempt in 2007 with the Gateway competition, then now addressing the N11 as such, and the main entrance into the college. So there's going to be the Centre for Creativity, which is under development by Stephen Hall Architects in New York, which is going to be, it's like engineering and architecture workshops and studios, and then also the Centre for Future Learning, which is beside Ardmore, very near the lake. But yeah, there's a new sports centre, and there's also new housing by RTÉ and U. So there's this is called, this image, this aerial view encapsulates the future campus.
I don't know if we'll be sitting here talking about Belfield 100. We mightn't make it that far. We might get to talk about Belfield 75 at some point along the way and see where we are then. Listen, Daniel and Ellen, thank you so much. It was a really, really interesting conversation, and I hope for those listening that the different areas that we covered hopefully brought back some great memories, perhaps one or two lake stories along the way as well. But thanks very much, and a pleasure to be with you both this evening. And I think, Camille, I'll hand back to you at this point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, guys. That was a really interesting conversation and a really nice little trip down memory lane. There are so many details that I definitely missed even at my time at UCD. So really thank you all so much for joining us tonight. So if you who are watching us are interested in the details and the location of the exhibitions or in purchasing the book that they've mentioned, everything can be found on the Belfield 50 website, which you can find in the description box here. You may also be interested in a special Belfield 50 Sunday miscellany to be broadcast on RTÉ Radio on 31st of January. UCD will also produce a film, 50 Voices, sharing some of the stories from Belfield. If you have a gem from your student days or you'd like to submit it for this project, the contact details are found on the Belfield 50 website as well. So we just have a few final notes before we wrap up this evening. UCD in Conversation will return in 2021 with a brand new lineup. We would love for you to join us, so keep an eye on the In Conversation homepage, which you can find in the description box as well. And if you have any topic suggestions for next year, we would love to hear from you. Please email alumni@ucd.ie to let us know. I would also like to mention that UCD is committed to supporting our students, both current and incoming, through the COVID crisis. To date, over €300,000 has been raised by generous alumni and friends of UCD. Thank you to those of you who have already supported this important cause. If you'd like to support our efforts to provide urgent financial and mental health support to students who need it most, you can visit the link below in the description box. So just to wrap up, thank you for taking the time to join us this evening, and thanks again to our speakers, Seán, Ellen, and Daniel. Wishing you all a wonderful holiday season, and we'll see you next year.